Okay, right. I'll stand here if I may. I'm going to block. That's all right.
No, that's all right.
Okay. Well, first, thanks for inviting me, Christian. And I just want to talk a little bit more about one or two of the themes that Catherine has raised, particularly about if we're looking to address the question of the future of London. There, of course, are a number of ways, and different people with different interests will, of course, want to look at it through the lens that they would normally approach this big question. But I mean, for me, the overwhelming issue is the spectacular growth of the city's population. London is growing at the rate of 100,000 a year, which will take its population to, we now know these figures, 9 million, then on to 10 million by around 2030. And this is an extraordinary rate of growth by historic standards. And it has a number of implications, and some of which Catherine has talked about. I'm a big supporter of population growth in the sense that it's certainly better than the opposite. London in the 60s and 70s, and the 70s in particular, was suffering in some places from abandonment. And even then, when the population was falling sharply, it is worth noting that there was still a housing crisis. I mean, in a sense, population going up or down, there was still a housing crisis even then. So housing crises and shortage of housing are not only products of rapidly rising population. London is increasingly different. I mean, we can't get away from this. I mean, it wasn't just the recent elections, previously London had been rather like Great Britain politically, actually, in terms of its vote for the major parties. It has now, to some extent, begun to break away. It's been tilting leftwards, and it didn't tilt very far UKIP-wards, and that is distinctive within British politics, and that, in some ways, is a manifestation of the extraordinarily variegated and different population that has come with the growth, and will continue to get more and more so. But, as Catherine intimated, as we grow the city at this scale, transport, housing, schools, the NHS, police, roads, utilities, not all of them the mayor's empire, not all of them in the public sector directly, all of these things have to grow pro rata. And I'm not sure at the moment that anything like, and this is not particularly a criticism of the current administration, it was true of the previous one actually at City Hall, that planning for this degree of growth is something that any mayor would have to fix as an absolute priority all the time. And so, in terms of transport, it's going to be a mixture of managing congestion, and not only road space congestion, but clearly road space congestion is both a threat and an opportunity, though to go for charging road space is difficult. I mean, Ken Livingstone, when mayor, carefully and against advice really extended the congestion charge west a bit, and that was it. So I don't think they'd have gone much further, and that was a very brave act. So for any mayor to go a lot further with using a congestion charge to reduce the scale of traffic on the road would require enormous political bravery, but of course potentially would bring a huge revenue stream. I mean, that is the trade-off. It would be an enormous potential revenue stream if it were to be introduced. But there will have to be more lines. I mean, we have to accept more rail lines, better use of rail lines, and indeed probably using the existing infrastructure slightly against the flow. I mean, we're going to have to think about extending central London still further in order to use transport capacity in both directions, and that has implications, of course, for planning and where people live. In the matter of housing, now, it is true, and Catherine's absolutely right, housing has rocketed up the political agenda in London. But I would say, as a non-housing expert, it is, more than any other sphere of endeavour I occasionally bump into, full of people fighting sort of historic wars, proxy wars, and culture wars. No other sphere of endeavour, it seems to me, produces quite so much of this. And on the matter of, and I'm not disagreeing with Catherine, but I just want to sort of flag a difficulty with the demand for social and affordable housing at scale from new developments, because it does, however you look at it, boil down to taxing something we want, i.e. housing, to get more of something we want, i.e. housing. Now, I'm not saying that developers don't get away with it on some occasions, of course they do. However, if you look at, I'm fascinated myself by the Battersea development, where density and scale of development is being used to pay for, well, the rebuilding of a massive power station, which the state won't pay for, and indeed the extension of a tube line, because a lot of the revenues paid by the housing, or the tax revenues, will be used to pay for the tube line. Now, I'm not against that either, but it does have implications for the physical form of the area. It is very, very, very dense, and whilst that makes perfect sense London-wide, it doesn't make sense for people nearby. No development ever makes sense for people nearby. And that, I think, points to a reality for whoever becomes mayor in 2016. God almighty, the years pass, don't they? 2016, 15, 16, there's one more referendum this year, this never stops. The next mayoral election, it's going to beg a question about how far the Mayor of London will be willing to use their powers to drive through change. And you only have to articulate that. See, it's very, very challenging. The boroughs are empires to themselves. They proudly run the things they do. But in the end, the bigger the population and the more densely packed the city is, the more in the end you're faced with the need for top-down government that can override opposition. And the reason I point this out is that it was the attempt by the Greater London Council to build housing in Outer London that sowed the seeds of its destruction. So you have to be very careful with this. The boroughs are much more resilient than citywide government, and yet, as the city grows, citywide government will have to take more power and be more drive through change. And getting that balance requires enormous subtlety on the part of any mayor. It's been a challenge both for Ken Livingstone and for Boris Johnson, and it will actually intensify as time goes on. Briefly, schools and hospitals, and I agree with Catherine about this. Schools, London now has more overcrowded schools than any other part of the country. It's not part of the mayor's empire, but the mayor has enormous authority to lobby on any question. The NHS clearly needs all manner of reform and change. Now, that's not to yet another reform and change, but the question of how much we do in hospitals, what's done to primary care, and so on, is well beyond my known world, but obviously in need of reform. And again, the mayor doesn't directly control these things, though they could lobby to. But the mayor will definitely, I think, have a leadership role in getting the schools and healthcare system we need. And on the police, I completely agree with Catherine about this. I think the police, personally, and I'm the only person in Britain who believes in this, I think, perhaps Christian might, I think we need to have a bit more political control over the police. It's a very, very controversial thing to say this. We've all grown up in a sort of post-Dixon of Dock Green world in which, the benign chief constable or commissioner independently makes all the decisions and politicians provide the money and some accountability after the event. I just don't think that model's sustainable. I think, and I'm not saying of course I don't want the mayor or the mayor's office directing police operations. We don't want that. But somehow allowing politicians greater toehold in how the police organise themselves and exactly how they do their business, not down to each individual activity. I think the boundary needs to be shifted somewhat. And that could be something that the Mayor of London, with their enormous legitimacy. The central government Jackie Smith discovered that as Home Secretary, she couldn't in the end sustain in office a police chief that the Mayor of London didn't want. And that tells you something about the power of the Mayor of London as an office, I think. Now, finally, I chaired for the current Mayor something called the London Finance Commission. The London Finance Commission had reported, and it was a all-party thing, actually more Labour politicians on it than Conservative ones, reported suggesting that London should get greater control of its own, particularly property tax base. Now, against the backdrop of Scotland and Wales, which have been given income tax, much more radical than anything the LFC suggested for London, I do think it's worth the Mayor of London lobbying, whoever the Mayor is, lobbying for greater financial independence. And remember, this isn't UDI for London, it's not London city state or breaking away. If it worked, this would mean that the taxes controlled by the mayor sort of went from by London's government, mayor and boroughs, went from around 6% to about 12%. So central government would still control the other 88%. And that does not, therefore, mean that London's growth and the tax-based growth would somehow always be kept in London and the rest of the country would be starved. It wouldn't work like that, but it would allow London politicians to benefit from decisions they made about growing the economy and growing the tax base through housing and other developments in a way that the money could then be held locally and reinvested. Actually, just a bigger version of the model that's being used to pay for the Northern Line extension that I was talking about at Battersea. So it's only doing that at a bigger scale. So I do think there's a lot to be said in the context of Scotland and Wales for giving London greater control over its own finances, so the mayor and the boroughs can make more decisions locally in order to accommodate the growth in all the infrastructure and public services more generally that will be needed by this very rapidly growing population. Thank you.